How many unfinished quilts do you have? As quilters, we call those UFOs, unfinished objects. And I have more than 31 of them. Probably it's about 41, something like that. I haven't really counted them, but I know there are a lot. This December, I hosted a 15 minutes to quilt challenge. I was trying to show how much work could get done 15 minutes at a time and show that you can make whole quilts just working on it a little bit every day. To make sure that it stayed interesting for everybody, I just picked up all of my works in progress, all of my UFOs, so that people would have a different quilt to look at every day and they wouldn't get bored by seeing the same project over and over again. And I thought that was it. It's just a lesson to keep working on a quilt over and over again until it gets done and not look for big long periods of time that's available to be able to make a quilt. I learned a lot more than that during this challenge. As I was picking up all of these old quilts and being reminded about what they were like and what made them stuck, I got a really deep lesson on why my quilts were not finished. And I thought I'd share those with you. So this is 9 reasons why my quilts are stuck, why they got stalled, why they were unfinished. I thought I'd share these 9 reasons with you. And I'm also going to share with you the ways that I can get unstuck with these quilts. Because for me, just getting these quilts finished is important. Okay, so here they are in no particular order. One of the reasons why my quilts get stuck is it's too much work. It's just a tedious process, especially for quilts that have a lot of blocks. After making block after block after block, it just gets monotonous and it gets tiring. I just don't want to work on that same block over and over again. It's just not enough variety for me, so I put it aside and then I don't pick it up again. And this happens not just with piece blocks. The hand stitching and the applique quilts also have that same problem for me, where it just feels like it's just taking too long to get to another success, to another step where things are done and it feels like I've made some progress. Another reason why my quilts get stuck is that I don't have the skills to make that quilt. It happens when, I see a beautiful quilt, I want to make it, and then I find out that, I just don't really know how. For the Dear Jane quilt, for example, I don't really know how to paper piece, and so that quilt is stuck just because I just don't have the skill set to work on it. There were other ones that also did the same thing, like the 1,000 Pyramids quilt. When I decided to make that quilt, I just wasn't familiar with how to use triangles and make sure that the points stay sharp, things like that. In the Kaleidoscope quilt, trying to match those points was very difficult for me when I'm putting the blocks together. Another reason why my quilts get stuck is that they are ugly. I worked on whatever it was that I was working on. I made the blocks, I made the quilt top, and then it just doesn't look like I was expecting it to look like. It just doesn't appeal to me, and I don't know really how to fix it, or maybe I do know how to fix it, but it involves unpicking things and trying over again, and that's just more than I want to do. Another reason why my quilts get stuck is because I don't have the right equipment. When I was quilting my Olympics quilt, I did not have a flatbed on my machine, and I was stacking up books and they would never stack up exactly right, and then the quilts would get stuck between the books, and also some of my piece blocks weren't properly pressed to the right side, so they were very lumpy, and so I kept breaking needles as I was trying to quilt through those. And it just needed for me to get the right equipment in order for me to make progress on that quilt. Another reason why my quilts get stuck is I was being too hard on myself. The Kaleidoscope quilt, for example, when I'm looking at the blocks now, they look fine to me. There are some minor flaws where it's not exactly, the points don't match exactly right, but they're close enough and they would have been fine on a quilt. But at that time, I was so stuck on the fact that the quilt looks a certain way and that I wasn't allowed to make any mistakes and I had to unpick any mistakes that I made, that the quilt just got stalled because then it just got too frustrating for me. Yet another reason why my quilts got stuck is the disorganization. I had several quilts, the Wildflower Sampler quilt, for example, and also the Shakespeare in the Park quilt. The pattern was not in the box with the fabric and the blocks that had already been made. And because of that, I really couldn't make a lot of progress on the quilt without finding the pattern. Also, I had some quilts where I had had ideas about how to do something. Like my 4-patch posy quilt is a quilt that I had an idea for a setting of the quilt, and I had made it in EQ4. It was a long time ago, obviously. Electric Quilt 4 is the software that you can design quilts with, and I had designed the setting for this quilt, and I had a computer crash and I lost that, and I hadn't printed out the pattern, so now I had to think of a whole new setting for the quilt because I don't remember what it was. But I do know that there were a lot of colors, a lot of fabrics that I was choosing for it, so it wasn't a really simple setting. And another reason is that I was just having a bad day when I was making the quilt. Maybe the temperature wasn't too hot or too cold, or the neighbors were being too noisy, or I just had a really hard day at work and it was hard for me to do something that required a lot of thinking. And because it was so frustrating for me when I put it away, I just didn't want to take it out again because I was just expecting that same frustration to come back again, because I blamed it on the quilt instead of my environment. And that was another reason why my quilt got stuck. Another reason why my quilts got stuck is mistakes in the quilt. So there were some mistakes that I made that needed to be unpicked, and I just was frustrated about having to unpick them and just worried about having to go through that process. So like my kaleidoscope quilt had a few pieces where the blocks were put together wrong. My 1,000 Pyramids quilt had the triangles that were not the same size. The Amalfi Coast border fabric was too short, and so I had to cut larger amounts. The way I fixed that was to just add another fabric to it, and it works really well with the blocks the way they were designed, to just add a fabric that wasn't the same as the other border fabric. I think it's going to make the quilt look better than the original solid border. Another reason why my quilts get stuck is that there are so many squirrels out there. There's so many other quilt projects that are available. It's really hard for me to limit myself in what quilts I work on. And part of it is the out of sight, out of mind. So if I put a quilt away, then this other project that's out here is very tempting to start, even though I have so many other projects that need worked on. And some of that has to do with the community. So if a community is working on Dear Jane quilts, and I get all excited about that and I get started on the Dear Jane quilt, and if the community is working on the Bonnie Hunter quilts, then I want to join that. And even though all of those sew-alongs are really fun to join, for me, because I'm so slow at quilting, working only 15 minutes a day, then it takes me a whole year to work on a big project like that. And then it just puts all the other quilts in the backlog. I put them away, and then I head on to the next squirrel instead of going back to the quilts that I had still waiting for me. Okay, let's talk about how to fix these issues in getting these quilts unstalled, get them unstuck, get them finished. If you wouldn't mind, just hit the subscribe button while I get ready for the next part. So there are 4 ways that I can think of to get these quilts unstuck. First of all, to keep all your pattern and your fabric and all your notes, everything together in one box. Keep it all together so that when it is time to pick it back up again, everything is all nice and neatly organized. Make sure that you write notes so that you know where you left off, so that you can easily pick up again. I would write notes about your color choices and your thoughts about the layout, what you don't want to do, anything that you can think of, because for me anyway, I never know when I'm going to pick up this quilt again. It could be decades before I pick it up again. It would be really hard to remember where you left off and all the thoughts that you were having about how to work on this quilt. Another way that I can get those UFOs unstuck is to relax your standards. There are times when I just have this idea of perfection and what I expect the quilt to look like. If I just relax my standards and relax into the quilt and let it lead me to where the quilt should look like, it really makes a big difference. Instead of fighting with the quilt, I'm just going with the flow and taking it where it leads me. And I wind up getting a much better quilt when I'm working intuitively instead of fighting with it the whole time. Another way to get your quilts unstuck is to change the plan. Whether you don't remember the plan or whether the plan is something that just doesn't work for you, you can easily change it in a way that would work for you in order to get it done. You can change the plan in order to get the quilt done. For the album quilt, I had those mitered corners. I decided to change up the quilt so it won't have the mitered corners, and that'll make the quilt easier to make, and I'll be able to finish that off. For the Olympics quilt, I decided that I wasn't going to expect perfection in the quilt, and I just want to finish it no matter what. So when I was quilting it, I didn't bother to mark all the lines. I'm just letting it free flow and just to get it done. And for the African garden quilt, I had made a quilt top that I thought was ugly, and I didn't really know how to make it look better, and I was thinking about different ways to do it. Like I could add another fabric that would calm down the bright colors, because I just thought it was too bright, which I didn't know that there was such a thing as too bright, but for this quilt it seemed like it was too bright. And so once I found the African fabric, I was able to add that and make a quilt that I really like. And also the thing about the African garden quilt is I relaxed my standards. So normally I would choose a lot of different choices and try to pick the right one. And in this one, I just let this fabric intuitively guide me into how I was going to work on this quilt. So instead of finding like a blue color, instead of finding a cool colorway and comparing that to the African fabrics, I just went with my first idea, my first instinct, and that worked really well for me. And last but not least, the one that I hadn't really thought about before, I did this 15 minutes to quilt challenge, is to schedule time to work on the quilt. I already knew that I had friends who spread out their quilt projects to make it like a block of the month, and so they would just work on some blocks every month, and at the end of the year then they would have enough blocks to work with. So I already knew about that, but I never thought about going back to my old quilts just to make 15 minutes worth of progress on them from time to time to see if I could get them unstuck. And that's really eye-opening for me to see that there are times when I picked up these quilts that they weren't as hard as I thought they were going to be. Maybe I had developed enough skill sets to be able to do it. Maybe I had found the right equipment to work on it. Maybe I figured out that it wasn't as frustrating as I thought it was going to be because I'm not tired today and I was the last time I worked on this quilt. And maybe I just wasn't as hard on myself anymore because it's an old quilt and I just want to get it finished. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to move forward in the progress. And so even if it isn't a perfect strategy, or even if the blocks don't look exactly right, it's fine. It's just a matter of getting the quilt finished. Another way that I think about fixing them to stop having stalled projects is to focus on the quilts that you think are the most beautiful. If you just work on the quilts that excite you, instead of going with the flow, instead of going with what everybody else is doing, I think it might be easier to just stay focused on that one quilt until it's finished. Another idea that I have about how to stop having UFOs, this is a preventative and not a way to get your quilts going, is to work on smaller quilts. Smaller quilts are much faster to make. They let you get that urge out about making that particular kind of quilt, and then they're finished before they get a chance to get stalled. I hope these ideas are helpful for you. I'm curious to know, why do your quilts get stuck, and what do you do about them? Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of your support, and we'll see you again in the next video.